Hello, everybody, and welcome to the UEF Podcast, which today is going to be examining a very interesting intersection of ideas, primarily the relationship between the thinking we do at night and loving, learning, and playing, which is the key to flourishing. Now, today, as a host, I am Christophe Perot. I am a PhD researcher in philosophy. I have been a scholar in residence at the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism, as well as a Dean's Fellow at Harvard University. And I am delighted to be hosting the great Dr. Matthew Nini, who is a research associate at the Institute of Philosophy in Zagreb, Croatia. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Albert Ludwig University in Freiburg, Germany. He is the author of 3 books, Fichte in Berlin, the Book of Nocturnes, and Schelling's Ages of the World, which is to be published in 2026. Now, the book that we are examining predominantly today is the Book of Nocturnes. So before we begin, would you like to kind of introduce what the book is about, Dr. Nini?
Yes, well, thank you, Christophe Perot, for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And the audience ought to know that we're old friends and acquaintances from the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism, among other places, trips to France and your partly.
We have had our adventures.
Indeed. The book I've written is perhaps a strange book for an academic to write, but it is very much an expression of freedom and of thinking in a way that is unconventional insofar as it is a thinking that seeks to connect with human experience that academic writing and thinking can sometimes miss. And I've tried to phrase this through the metaphor of day and night. Day is the place of logic. It's the place where things are linear and proceed from the first step to the last step, going from beginning to end. Things are identifiable, have limits, are logical. Whereas the night symbolizes something more human, something less linear, something darker, where things are not as easily visible as they are in the daytime. And so night thinking is a way of tapping into part of the human experience that is lost in the peer-reviewed journal article or the scholarly monograph, the kind of thinking that is maybe better represented by religion, myths, stories, poetry, music. That, in summary, is what the book is about.
But that's very interesting because typically people would say, you want to walk into the light, right? You want to see clearly, you want to get out of the dark. And you seem to be suggesting that there is an element of wonder in the darkness. There is something spectacular in the darkness, worthy of our exploration, that might even connect us to a deeper sense of reality than we can find in the supposedly clear and lucid elements of the day. Is that correct?
Indeed. Well, our rational self, I think, is only part of the story of who we are as human beings. And of course, the old light metaphor that is very common in world religions of coming out of the darkness, walking into the light, this is very often a question of morality, of turning away from what is evil into the good. One thinks of Plato's analogy of the cave, where one lives in ignorance deep in a dark cave, and then as one rises up towards the sun is the symbol of the form of the good, the wellspring of all that is good. But on a human level, on the level of what we might philosophically call phenomenology, that is a sort of examination of our own human experience, we might say that light comes out of the darkness, that in a certain way it's the opposite, that we as finite, limited, very small creatures cannot simply begin with absolute rationality and logic. We come out of a place where we know nothing. We're born and we have no experience of life. Something has to begin. But what do we possess from the beginning? We possess something that is there in the dark, as it were, in the night. And that I think, especially the Abrahamic religions, but perhaps the other great world religions, the sort of axial age religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, bring out, this idea of wonder. Philosophy
Mm.
begins, and we see this in Plato, we see this with Socrates. Philosophy begins with something called tomatzein in Greek. That is wonder. The fact that I am here, that everything is, that it presents itself to me, is full of mysteries, full of questions. And one ought to dwell in this feeling before jumping immediately to answers so as not to forget the more human relation that we have with these things.
So that's amazing. And William James comes to mind because he was a philosopher who kind of found it amazing to think about the mere fact that we exist. He thought that was astounding. Like, that's weird, right? We exist. How curious, how bizarre, right? And you seem to be reinvigorating through the Greek tradition that sense of the astonishment at our existence, which you base in wonder, right? Does that sound
Yes,
fair?
yes. I'm perhaps doing it in a minor key compared to the way that you've expressed it with such infectious enthusiasm. Since the book, the metaphor of darkness can be extended to the whole part of the human experience that we don't always want to look at, to melancholy, to mysticism, to the conversations that we have with ourselves when no one is looking, to the dark corners of human existence, of our own souls, of the ecstasies that we live as human beings. And so the book is not written in a linear way, meant to make a linear argument. That would be a way of writing that is bound by the rules of the day. And the book consists of
Mm.
170 fragments. Now, what is a fragment? A fragment is a thought or a story, a narrative that is fundamentally unfinished. It
Mm-hmm.
begins somewhere and then never goes anywhere afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
It trails off, as it were. So the thought is begun, something is constituted, something is formed, whether it's an anecdote about a person, an observation about something, a historical remark, the interpretation of a text, and then it's left off in a sort of poetic way. It wanders off into the night, and the reader is left to meditate on this. And of course, these don't proceed in linear fashion. You don't have to read the first fragment and then the second and then the third. You could, in theory, open the book up to any page and begin reading and find something to engage with, to dialogue with, since a huge element of the book is connecting with one's inner dialogue partner, what Socrates called his daimon, his inner interlocutor.
Mm-hmm.
And this silent conversation is, I think, the essence of philosophy. And this is what happens when one dwells in wonder. A sort of dialectic of dialogue begins. And we see
Mm.
this in the Platonic tradition very, very clearly.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot there to unpack. But let me start with one thing, just to kind of, at UEF, we talk about shining a light on things, right? And in a way, it's kind of a metaphor for illuminating, bringing to central focus something that we're ignoring. In that way, do you feel like paradoxically you're kind of shining a light on the darkness, on what's considered the darkness, because we ignore its value, we ignore the night thinking has a meaningful contribution. So there's that element that I want to ask about. And the other element that I want to ask about is when you talk about these fragments that leave you to meditate, this does seem to touch upon a theory of how we learn, which is in a way to remember things, to recall things more than to merely be have things transmitted over to us. And so when you talk about fragments that leave you thinking, it seems like there's a trust between you and the reader that ultimately, if you send them down the path, they can go where they have to go for that point and moment in their life. They can go where they need to go. They can think through the implications and relevance of the fragment. And that level of trust seems wholesale ignored in modern educational systems. So I'm curious for the second point, what role you think trusting a kind of innate knowledge has in transforming educational experience for people.
There are a few elements in what you bring up. I think there are three, and I'll take them one by one. The third being the most significant one that we can dwell on a little longer in our conversation. The first is this paradoxical relationship of light and darkness, night and day. The old metaphor is, of course, to shine light on things.
Mm-hmm.
But to shine light presumes that there is some darkness on which it must shine, and that there is some background. Light is always sort of a concentration of light. In order to really be bright, it has to be concentrated. A diffuse light doesn't really make anything very distinct at all. So one might say an art metaphor that thinking for me in a really human fashion is about inhabiting a sort of chiaroscuro. You know, if you look at a great Renaissance painting, a Rembrandt is the master, you always see in Rembrandt these very profound shadows and then these beautiful moments of light shining and alighting on a particular figure's face or an event, some shining object, a piece of jewelry, or the latch on an old book. And it is precisely this idea of bringing out what is most important in relief that Knight is trying to address.
That almost sounds a bit like Epicurus with ataraxia, right? That the ultimate pleasure is a relief from suffering. Like that there's something in the contrast that brings meaning and increases the value of the activity at stake. And you mentioned Rembrandt. I would add maybe Caravaggio, who always has the light coming from outside the painting, but into a relatively dark scene. And because the light is going into a relatively dark scene, it's actually more prominent. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, there's something Caravaggesque about this way of thinking that highlights certain elements. I think that's an excellent metaphor. Onto the question of education, you know, the second and third points. Perhaps the second point that I would like to make in response is that education thinking should be a question of trusting the student and trusting the reader, since, well, of course, I believe in learning. There are fragments that make a sort of ironic criticism of teaching, to make a Socratic point. That is to say, if one really trusts the student, one cannot teach the student in the way that the modern technological, scientific pedagogue would imagine the student should be taught, or perhaps not so much the pedagogue as the administrator at whose whose beck and call the pedagogue is doing his contemporary work, or perhaps mischief. One could liken this to an idea from Martin Heidegger, technology in Heidegger. Now, there's an idea, you know, if you read Heidegger's essay concerning the question of technology, Technik is not simply a bunch of things. It's an attitude, a way of approaching the world. We see this with artificial intelligence today. People think that AI will replace them. I think that's often because they approach the world as a series of tasks to be accomplished, of little boxes to be ticked. Of course, if you see your life as a bunch of little boxes to be ticked, AI will do it better than you can. But that's not fundamentally not what life is. And if you see education in this very, very transactional way, sort of opening up the head and pouring in information and then sealing it up again, well, that won't get you very far. That is treating the human as if it were merely a piece of technology, whereas the human is something alive and breathing. And this means that the fundamental attitude of the teacher should be this faith in the student to be able to think the problem through. Again, a quotation from Heidegger. I don't want to lean too heavily on him, but he's coming to mind today. The best respect, the greatest respect that one can pay to a thinker is to think his thoughts through to conclusions that he himself had not reached. And I'm hoping that the Night Book will be, as I call it, the Book of Nocturnes, a means for people to think through questions for themselves, having only begun with me and having been put on the scent, as it were, of a particular question or a particular matter. Thirdly, how are we to conceive of education if we think of it in that way? Of course, you know from past associations that I have a background in the history of Platonism, and I'm committed to keeping the Platonic tradition of thinking alive. Now, the first thing that should be said about that is that Plato is a teacher, but he's not a teacher in the technological sense of teaching, where he just wants money from students so that he can try to pour facts into their heads and then send them off. Plato wants to awaken a sense of wonder in the student so that they can perform philosophy for themselves. This is very important. The way of expressing this is tied to a metaphysical, so a theoretical point in Plato's philosophy, which is the idea of, in ancient Greek, anamnesis, remembering. There's a famous part in the Meno, one of Plato's dialogues, where Socrates brings a young boy, who is a slave boy who has had no education, to the sand, and says to his dialogue companion, "This boy does not need to be taught geometry. He knows it." And Socrates sort of does what a good teacher would do. He walks the boy through how to do a math problem. What are the characteristics of the sides of a triangle? And from this, Socrates argues that it was something that the boy remembered. Of course, there's a Platonic mythology behind this, of the soul having lived before, having been clothed in forms, having come down to earth, having remembered the most essential things, not the contingent, finite, fleeting things, but that which is most essential about the soul. I think that what we can retain from this story is that learning has the structure of remembering because we learn as our own teachers in dialogue with ourselves. And you know better than I do some of the contemporary theories about innate knowledge and
cognitive nativism
and things like this. There's a parallel to be made. I'm not interested in the philosophy of mind, and so that is not something in which I am terribly conversant. But as a metaphor for the curious way in which we learn, it is something to be retained. I'm remembered of a lovely passage in a novel, before you jump in and comment, that I think your listeners should read, because it's a beautiful novel. I think it has been translated into English by the Austrian novelist Heimto von Doderer, and it is called Die Dämonen, the demons. And in it you have a character who's a working class boy, but who's very bright and manages to begin a relation with a bourgeois girl. And from this girlfriend, what they do together might sound incongruous to the contemporary mind, but when they are alone together in the back of a shop, they study Latin. And she's going to school, and she's going to a very good classical gymnasium, classical high school, has classical languages, and teaches him Latin. And there is a beautiful moment in the book when he is reading some Latin text, and one sees the inner thought process of his at work. At the exact moment when he discovers that he is no longer translating in his mind the text from Cicero or whoever he's reading, but really reading it, having made it his own, engaging with it. That's a moment of wonder. This great miracle of learning, of really understanding something, is a moment of wonder. And it brings us back to that which is oldest in us, the most fundamental aspect of our humanity, that openness.
Right. And there's so much to say. I'll just highlight that Platonic theory of remembrance seems to have an echo in some of the great religious and metaphysical traditions of the day, notably Islam. where you don't convert, you revert, you remember who you are. And
Yes.
of course, at UEF, we like to talk about our deepest longings, our love, learn, and play. And typically, what happens is that we forget about those deep longings, about who we are, about what we care about. And we forget through false narratives. We forget by prioritizing the means to our goal as though it's the end in itself and not the means to the end. There's multiple ways we forget who we are, but there's a great parallel between your work and that basic intuition that life is ultimately not about constructing in a voluntaristic or will oriented manner something new, but recalling something real. Does that sound like a fair analogy to draw? That we're recalling something real about ourselves?
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm reminded of St. Augustine saying, "Late have I loved thee, O wisdom so ancient and so new." This is the great moment of realizing that in knowledge, my knowledge is my love, and I come back to my great love, the thing that was there at the beginning, this
Right.
edification of the soul,
Mm.
the recollection of what has been lost. In the book, there is a passage where I discuss a moment in Dante's Divine Comedy that I think illustrates this well. It's a sort of mise en abîme, or a moment when Dante, the character, the protagonist, is called to consciousness, as it were. And what happens is, passing through purgatory on his way to heaven, he has to be
Mm.
purified. That's what purgatory means. And he passes by the river Lete, the river Lethe, which is the river of, in classical mythology, Greek mythology, the river of forgetfulness. One drinks
Mm.
of its water and forgets everything. And this is meant to be part of a mental purification, purification of memory on the part of the pilgrim. And so he drinks this water, and Beatrice, his companion, his beloved, this angelic figure, says to him, "Well, now we can proceed." And Dante sort of says, "Well, who are you?" you know? And
Mm.
uh, Beatrice answers, "O poet, you have forgotten everything, you have forgotten your sins, but at least remember that you have forgotten, and you will be able to make your way."
Mm.
The force that propels Dante forward in purgatory after this moment of forgetfulness is this return to the center, as it were. I remember that I've forgotten. What have I forgotten? What is most essential? What is not merely data in me that can be erased and written over? What remains? Well, the heart remains.
Mm. Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit? When you talk about the heart, what do you mean by the heart? Because obviously, I imagine you don't uniquely mean the organ in the body.
Of course not. Traditionally, I mean, we all know this, that in literature and in philosophy, the heart in the West is the classic metaphor for love and for the impulses that drive humanity forward. In the Hebraic tradition, this is or in the Middle East at least, generally, this is the guts, I think. It's more the tripes that have this role. And there's something to that as well. But we, at least in our European tradition, think of the heart as being the place of the seat of emotion, the seat of affect, and also that which is most intimate. It is in the
Mm-hmm.
heart that one has conversations with oneself, in the soul that one has conversations with oneself. With whom? With some inner guest. What does one find in the heart? Not mere intellectual content, but something really human, something deeply felt, some energy that can move one forward. And this, in the Abrahamic religions, is very clear that this is love, this driving factor. This is the again, to return to Dante, when he looks up and he sees God in the heavens, having achieve the end of his journey. The last lines of the Divine Comedy refer to the love that moved the heavens and all the other stars. And he's talking about the prime force, the first mover of the universe, which is the infinite God.
Mm.
So he places love as not only as the force that is moving the universe, but as that which is most intimate to him.
Mm. So it's not merely that love produces effects that are worthy of experiencing, and it's the mover of the universe. It is also that love is most thoroughly authentic to our inner being in a certain way, in this case that you've spelled out. Does that sound fair?
Absolutely. And I've often said that if one really wants to learn something, there should be some great love driving it. I think this is
Mm.
especially true in the case of learning a language, which, as you know, as a multicultural person, half American, half French, with a foothold in both languages and both cultures, this can be devilishly hard because a
Mm-hmm.
language is an entire universe.
Mm-hmm.
One simply decides that one will learn Persian or Arabic or Mandarin Chinese and sits down and starts studying, sheer willpower will get you quite far, but you will need an awful lot of it in order to reach your goal. Some love of the culture, of a family, of a place, of a person, of a cherished experience will have to drive forward your linguistic journey. Otherwise, you probably won't make it very far. The cost, the cognitive cost of the willpower is just too much to be done in a state of indifference.
I
Whereas
agree.
the
Which
love
is
has to be the weight, to use another Augustinian phrase.
which is probably why they so often say the best way to learn a language is to go live in the country. It's probably not merely the hyper exposure you get to the language, which could be induced in other forms through extraordinary rigorous study and so forth, but also the fact that you start to love the people who speak that language. And
Hmm.
an internal drive emerges to push you forward through the love, to acquire a better and better capacity to express yourself and to understand them. So, love is that great ingredient in this process. I agree with that very strongly. Now, one thing I want to ask you about as well is we've talked about wonder, we've talked about the way we learn or remember, and we've talked about love a little bit, but it all coalesces into the role of play in education. And I think there's something not only very playful about your work in the sense that you're just kind of throwing these fragments out there for people to kind of play with, be inspired by, meditate on, but also, if I'm not mistaken, there's something playful in your approach to education on the whole.
Hmm.
And I'll let you maybe articulate that if you're willing.
Perhaps you'd like to read a passage from the book with your magnificent reading voice, Christophe Borot,
With pleasure.
that could then be
Absolutely.
used as an illustration. This is the passage about the first, or rather the unmarked tarot card. You can
Okay, so this is 37, I think.
37 in the book. There, I should give the experts, since one never knows who will be listening on the internet,
Mm-hmm.
caveat that I had made a slight mistake, that the tarot card in question does not have the number 0. The magician, I believe that it is unmarked. So to read to us about the battleur, and I'll explain. This will be the catalyst to talk about Bildung and education and playfulness.
Great. So I will read it right now. This is fragment 37 from the Book of Nocturnes, and it goes like this. Let our patron as night thinkers be the figure found on the first tarot card, or the card before the first, the card given the number 0, the magician. The French say it better, and isn't the tarot from Marseille? He is the juggler, the battleur. His depiction on the card describes who he is. The young man wears a hat shaped like a figure eight. He stands in front of a small table. On the table are a yellow vase, 7 discs, 3 red and 3 yellow, 2 dice, a knife, a bag. He holds a rod in his right hand, a ball in his left. There are playthings, but to succeed at these games requires the utmost concentration. Yet it is not the severe concentration of work, but the easy concentration of play. To keep the discs in the air, the juggler must be entirely focused on the task, but not overthink it. For ruminating brings one away from the rhythm of juggling, from the easy playfulness of act. Do you wish to think night thoughts? Then learn to concentrate without effort.
Thank you. Thank you. The first thing that ought to be said is why use tarot cards when this doesn't sound terribly serious. It is part of the Western imaginary, these images that come from the Renaissance at least. And it highlights the esoteric side of this. There's something very mysterious about what I've called here concentration without effort. I think in modern terms, we would want to call this being in a flow state.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that has become, I mean, it's a theory that comes up in the 1990s. I think it starts to make headway in the late 20th century, and it's connected to other things. It's been taken up by cognitive science since then. And the idea is that if one thinks directly about the object of what one is doing, rather than simply being totally immersed in it, then one will lose this easy capacity to do it. One of the best examples would probably be playing an instrument. If you're playing piano on a very high level, or even just at home, anyone who has played an instrument knows that once you know the notes and you're not thinking about them, not reading the music, but playing the music, you can get very easily into a state where the music is simply sort of playing and you are in it. You were swept up in it. People playing certain sports might have this sentiment as well, where they're sort of in a zone, as it were. Classic cases, the tightrope walker, you need to be sort of concentrated, but not overthinking every step. Because when you start to ruminate, that's when you fall. That's when you're going to make a false note, play a bad note, the wrong note, or what have you, drop the ball. This is something fundamental about the way that we behave, and it is playfulness. This is what it means to play. Playing piano, playing a sport, being at the circus and seeing the tightrope walker who is fundamentally engaged in something by definition difficult, requiring skill, preparation, but playful. You sort of have to get out of the head and into the body, into the respiratory system, and simply let the rational part kind of function automatically, and it will work. It does produce the results, and to overthink would be too laborious. Rather, like analogously with what we were saying about love, if one thinks that willpower will achieve everything, the mental load will be excruciating and it will eventually fail. But if one does this with lightness, then it's much faster. Learning as a game, something playful, is much more agreeable and much more natural to the way that we do things, because we do have this capacity to be lost in games, in music, and even in learning.
Right. And this is very interesting because there's a lot that fades away when you talk about going into this concentration without effort, or the flow state, however we want to phrase it. The one of the things that fades away is time. You don't ruminate on time itself anymore because you're simply there. You're in a kind of timeless moment. It's very hard to track when you're concentrating without effort exactly how many minutes or hours you've spent, You could have a basic sense, but you really are just in the zone, in the moment, experiencing a timeless reality for that very precious experience. So time kind of disappears with the ruminating on time, but also, in a way, a suffering disappears because you're intrinsically motivated to keep going, to keep pursuing the very task at hand because you like the task. You are loving the task. So playing involves this loving element to it where you are loving what you're doing. So you don't worry about how much longer you have. You're not checking the clock. You don't worry about how well it's being performed. You're just happy to do it. And usually that improves the performance. But that's almost a side note benefit, that to the actual interior experience of merely playfully, lovingly participating in the very thing that is enabling you to let so many burdensome, ruminating elements of life vanish. Does that make sense so far?
This is a different way of living one's life that you're describing. If one thinks about what is called in the media hustle culture and this desire
Mm-hmm.
to achieve, to perform, to do more and more, this is willpower. This is sheer force of will trying to dominate, trying to ascend, to conquer. And it is too much daytime, as it were. And eventually,
Mm-hmm.
this will, to use my sustained metaphor, sink into the night. Anyone who engages in that kind of lifestyle will eventually burn out. Something will eventually go wrong. It won't be able to be sustained properly over the course of years and decades. That kind of concentration fizzles out. And then where does one find oneself? One finds oneself in what the psychoanalyst would call the depressive position,
Mm-hmm.
in the place where one's forces retreat, contract, concentrate onto themselves. And one must pass then through one's melancholy in order to see what is really good, what is really easy, and what can really be accomplished without so much effort. See,
Mm-hmm.
this would be the time to bring up a favorite topic of mine that we have spoken about before, which is a wonderful novel by Hermann Hesse that I can
Yes.
warmly recommend called The Glass Bead Game, Das Glasperlenspiel. This is the illustration of education as play. And the love element, of course, comes in towards the very end. Maybe we should add a spoiler alert to what I'm about to say.
Spoiler alert, everybody. Be ready.
Indeed. Hermann Hesse's last novel, The Glass Bead Game, is published in 1943, and it imagines a sort of distant future, or rather not so distant future, after the Second World War, when Europe has achieved a state of peace, and this hard-won state of peace in the German-speaking part of the world leads to the establishment of a pedagogical province. This is an expression borrowed from Goethe. And the pedagogical province is a place that will train the teachers for all of society, for all of the German-speaking world, called Castalia, Castalien in German. And the people who live in Castalien, who all seem to be men, are all celibate and live in a sort of monastic community. This is sort of a monastery. Now, given that Hesse's imaginary future is one that has been renewed by the discovery of Eastern spirituality, meditation is the backbone of what is done in Castalien to maintain rule and order and commitment in their lives. Now, some are sent out to teach in the world, but the majority of them would seem to simply stay and engage in what we would call research, or perhaps the intellectual life. The Germans have a wonderful word, die Muse, not Muse as in the muses, but die Musse as in leisure. To be a musischer Mensch, to be a a poetic person, a person of leisure, a person who reads and thinks, engages in discussion, and who lives the life of the mind for its own sake, for its beauty. This is what Castalian is. And so when one reads the book, as a writer, as a philosopher, one is entirely enchanted by this universe. Fascinating about it, though, most fascinating, is that its highest form of life, the most important thing that happens in this place, is a game, the glass bead game, the titular game of the novel. Now, Hesse never tells us exactly what the glass bead game is or how it's played, but it is described as being the synthesis of all forms of human knowledge. It's called the glass bead game because it would initially have been played with small marbles, small glass beads, to sort of occupy places almost like notes on a musical staff. Since music is, of course, the earliest foundation in Hesse's mind of all human sciences, the first sort of what we would call mathesis universalis in the Renaissance, the bringing together of all the forms of knowledge. Music is seen as doing this. But out of this combination of music and Eastern spirituality and this peaceful world, this pedagogical province, comes this game where the abstraction of something found in a Beethoven symphony can then find its response in a proposition from integral calculus, and then move on to Chinese literature of the classical period or what have you. And this summary of all human knowledge is a game. It's played for.
Right.
Now, however, there is a caveat, because there is a sort of decadence that is gnawing away at Castalian. One sees the figure of Fritz Tegularius, who is one of the main characters, who's based on Friedrich Nietzsche. One sees in him Nietzsche. Tegularius is the virtuoso glass bead game player, but he is of a sickly temperament, a sickly constitution, and doesn't meditate, and simply sort of frivolously engages in this game-like thing. So play can be frivolous if one is not careful. And so the main character, who is sort of parachuted into the role of the master of the glass bead game, the Magister Ludi, he, who is a great friend of Tegularius, has to confront the contradiction at the heart of the place where he lives, which is, on the one hand, the necessity of play as the primary element of bringing together all forms of human knowledge, and on the other, the decadence of those who simply do this as if it were a meaningless game. Hence the importance of serious play.
Right.
One plays seriously in a certain way. And so the question that comes up very early in the novel is whether or not the Magister Ludi, Josef Knecht, it's a very revealing name because Knecht in German means slave or servant. So Josef Knecht is, and of course, Joseph and his brothers from the Bible, someone who's sold into slavery and comes out of slavery. Josef Knecht must decide, do I stay here as the custodian of the rules of this game? Or is this playfulness to be lived in another way? And he eventually, and here's the spoiler alert, here's where you can skip ahead 30 seconds if you really want to read the novel. He decides that he will leave Castalian, and the job that he takes on in the world, this is sort of like leaving a monastery. He's then left to his own devices to go into the world with nothing but the clothes on his back, and becomes the preceptor, the tutor of one young boy, to share the wisdom he has acquired with this one person is an act that is greater and more meaningful than being the best glass bead game player. It is through this gravitational pull of love that we were talking about with Dante, with Augustine, with other figures, that he sees what this playfulness is about, this sort of divine playfulness of the love that moves the stars, that is playfully moving the universe forward, but is not playing games with us.
Mm. I would add Iris Murdoch to that list, the kind of the gravity of the good over us.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
that the good has its own pull, which we feel. We feel pulled towards the good. And it's very often the case that we suffer tremendously when we reconcile with the fact that we don't feel like we're good. That's one of the greatest sources of human suffering, to feel like you are not good. Not good in the instrumental sense, like good at a game, but good in a more ontological sense, like a good being, a good person. And it's a very difficult experience to endure, of course. And that would be, you know, if you're not loving, if you're not learning, if you're not playing, in a certain sense, you feel like you've gone away from who you are. And that is a great source of tremendous pain. And I wonder, you know, the other thing that you kind of bring up with the glass bead game that I think is a meta point of great significance, meta meaning a point about the point, right? Is that if we're looking to break the silos of human knowledge that are self-contained and indifferent to each other, the pathway forward could be through play.
Through play, but as I said, not through the frivolous kind of play, you know,
Not frivolous play, no.
but this play that
serious
is
play.
A serious play that is a commitment to the other, that is open to this encounter with the other. Look, as an extension of this, I'm writing a book on travel right now, sort of philosophical meditation on what it means to travel. And I think one of the most interesting typologies, one of the most interesting kind of travelers that you see in literature again and again and again, is the figure of the journeyman, you know, who is on a journey to learn something. And the prototype here is actually Hermann Hesse's inspiration, a figure that comes from Goethe, two novels about someone named Wilhelm Meister, Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre and Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre. So his wandering years, Wanderjahre, you know, the journeyman. What does it mean to be on one's journeyman years, which is how that book is translated into English, Wilhelm Meister's journeyman years. The journeyman, of course, initiates in sort of the medieval Germanic world where one learns a trade and goes around. After an apprenticeship, one has to go out and work, and goes from town to town, working with other masters, learning from them on the job, and eventually has to create a great work to present to the guild as proof of one's skill. Now, what moves that forward is not necessarily a plan. This is not what we would call an apprenticeship in the modern university sense. This is not a stage, as the French would say, or just a practicum that one makes in order to acquire experience, frankly, the vaguest term that one could apply to one's inner life. You know, what exactly does it mean? It has to be qualified as a term. What the journeyman is looking for, he does not really know. And it is only through the journey, through the encounters that are had, that it becomes clear. He goes knocking on doors. He arrives in a village. He needs a place to stay. He needs a bed to sleep in. He needs food. And he needs his day's wage. Journeyman comes from the French journée, so we're being paid by the day. And it is this moment of fragility, of encounter with someone else, of another door being opened, of entering into contact with someone. This playfulness of running around and finding some random place, but then the love in terms of friendships. It's friendship is one of the classical definitions of love that permits real learning to happen. And I think another great example, the illustration of what I'm saying, is in Goethe's own account of his own travel, his Italian journey, which is a beautiful book. It's really a beautiful book. And Goethe is 37 years old. He has been a writer, a statesman, a scientist for many years already, but felt that he needed to learn more. He needed to take what we would call a sabbatical and go to the source of all of the books that he found inspiring, which was Rome. Now, in the 18th century, traveling from northern Germany to the center of Italy was a long and difficult journey. And after being in Rome, he goes down into Sicily, passing through Naples, spends a lot of time in Naples. There's a very active social life there, comes back up, and on his way back to Germany, decides he'll go to Rome for a little while more, maybe a few weeks, maybe a season. He winds up staying in Rome for almost another year, a huge amount of time. And he writes three of his most incredible works while he's there, including one of the first versions of his famous Faust, the man who tries through his fist, through his Faust, his willpower, to gain knowledge. Goethe doesn't gain it through willpower. It's through this easy concentration of going places and being led by his encounters, by the people that are there. He has guides. He has, for example, the German painter Tischbein, who painted the famous picture of him lounging in the Campagna with a sort of a poncho and a hat on. And Tischbein had been living in Rome for a while and knew people there. And of course, if Goethe were living in our century, he would be given 6 months or some sort of sabbatical, would go down, would have goals, would check off the boxes, a sort of Heideggerian technological idea, and then he'd go back home. And where would Faust be? Where would the diary novel that is the Italian Journey? Where would that be?
So it almost sounds like, and you can correct me if this is not accurate, but it almost sounds like the journeyman and the general process of love, learning, and playing to their fullest requires, and night thinking, which invokes those elements, requires one to have an openness to an infinite horizon where you simply don't, it's a never-ending experience and you don't know exactly where it's going to go, but you follow the experience knowing that it can take you somewhere. Whereas the whole point of check marks and tasks and the technological version of the human being is precisely to make everything finite. You will finish this within 6 months. It will be 2 papers. It will be 1 article. It will be 1 speech. It will be this and that. And it will be done on this finite timeline. And you have to let go of the finite and kind of have an openness to the infinite horizon to really be a good journeyman, because you say, I don't know where this is going. I don't know if this is going. You're in the night thinking. You're with the mystery. And the mystery can be an endless mystery that you have to acquaint yourself with, I think. Now, I'm adding infinity into the equation, but does it seem reasonable to you? Feel free to correct me if it doesn't.
No, I think you're right. At least in the sense, infinity, in the sense of
never ending. Like maybe everlasting would be another way of putting it, more than infinity.
I would say simply not being put under absolute constraints of time.
No finitude.
Constraints about of the determinate, the absolute constraint of outcomes, which is a word that some university people like to talk about today. Outcomes or outputs. Because when you're really learning, you are sort of wandering around in circles, and the circle is the symbol of infinity, and the circle is the symbol of perfection. You're spiraling around. And of course, when you're on that kind of journey, if you knew where it was going to go and what you were going to achieve, why go on it? You already know what you're supposed to get out of it. If you decide what the goals are and you decide what the outcomes will be, this is sort of like the silliness of contemporary academics who have to write a research proposal. Many students or young people listening will recall having been enculturated into this insanity of being made to write a thesis and then being told, well, you'll have to write a proposal first where you tell us exactly what you're going to say. Well, why write a thesis if you've already given the outcome? What's the
completely point? Incompatible with the journey.
Exactly, exactly. Of course, every age has constraints, and we must work with the constraints in which we live. And there is space for playfulness, even if one has a very, very small marge de manœuvre, space to
Mm-hmm.
move. And so I think that this movement is something that one has to consider interiorly. Where am I going? We were talking about Goethe, about Wilhelm Meister. Goethe is on a Bildungsreise, an educational journey. Wilhelm Meister is the first Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman has become an English word. It's a story, a novel of education, or a novel of sentimental education, as it were. But what is this word, Bildung, that is lurking behind all of these expressions that I think is somewhere here? And my book, this is perhaps only proximate to the book, is a sort of expression of my own Bildung, and also a facetious, very playful attempt through an unreliable narrator to show how fun Bildung can be. Bildung does not have an exact English cognate. There is no one English word that corresponds exactly to what this means. One could say culture, one could say education. The French might say culture personnelle, but even that doesn't capture it. Bildung is having been educated on the level of one's heart as a human being. It is how all of the books one has read and all the experiences that allow one to interpret them move together. Bildung is what makes you a good glass bead game player. You're not simply able to memorize things and regurgitate facts. You don't just know a lot of things. You live them, you have them in you, like the way you speak a language. Not just something dead, like you would learn some ancient language, Sanskrit or something, but to really live and move and breathe in it, to have it on your lips. When the modern university, the modern research university was founded, it was not meant to be what it has become. It was founded in Berlin in 1809 by someone named Wilhelm von Humboldt, who gave Berlin its first university, and transformed the university precisely from the cathedral school of the Holy Roman Empire that was a vocational school for the three learned professions of medicine, theology, and law, into the means of expanding one's horizons as a human being. And I think that if you only have technical knowledge, you have a lot of learning, but you don't have a lot of education. Bildung, there's a wonderful book that I think anyone interested in philosophy or literature or Western culture should read, by someone named Werner Jaeger, Jaeger. Jaeger was a German classicist, and he wrote a book called Paideia, about education in ancient Greece, in 3 volumes. Bildung is the modern German sort of romantic concept of what paideia was amongst the Greeks, which is precisely education as a form of self-cultivation, education as exercise, education as providing a way of life, a moral education, a personal education, a spiritual education, not simply the compilation of random facts.
Well, I find that to be a highly inspiring, potentially an end note, because we've come up on the hour. And what I want to propose is you can have the floor for a final statement as you wish. I will do a little outro afterwards and say goodbye to everybody with a few key points of what we discussed. Or I can go to the outro now. What would you prefer, Dr. Nini?
I think that I've given you plenty of material, and I've just gone on a sort of very nice summary of my thought on the questions of love, live, play. So love, learn, play, rather. So you can sort of go to your outro now, and I'll turn off my microphone.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining this podcast episode with Dr. Matthew Nini, the incredible philosopher who, in a way, is having a little revolution against the way philosophy is being done. He is bringing us back into what he calls night thinking, which is the opportunity to explore the mysterious, to explore those elements within which we feel like we don't know the answer yet, to explore the infinite by extension. He is bringing us back into the possibility of organizing our lives around a deep sense that it's meaningful to become, to cultivate, to seek for a true sense, not to merely instrumentalize who you are for the sake of completing tasks, but to be who you are because it's important. So thank you very much, Dr. Matthew Nini, and thank you everybody who listened. Ciao.
It was my pleasure.